Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Adult Sci-Fi Fantasy debut panel. This is the first of a series for this year, so I'm so excited to kick it off with these early spring sci-fi fantasy releases. Just a quick sentence about me before the authors introduce themselves and tell us about their books. My name's Lily, and I'm the book reviewer behind Utopia State of Mind. And so we're going to have a Q&A also at the end. So if you have any questions throughout the panel, please leave them in the chat, and I will try to remember to get back up to where the questions were at the end. And so now we'll have the authors introduce themselves because I have a lot of questions. So I'm excited to get into it. Mia, do you want to start?
Hey everybody, I'm Mia Tsai. I am a Taiwanese American author of contemporary fantasy and spec fic, and my book is Bitter Medicine, an adult contemporary fantasy with romance in it, coming out March 14th, which is really, really soon. And it is, in short, it is about a magical calligrapher named Elle who is on a mission to protect her older brother from murderous family, and the hijinks that she gets into when she is no longer able to protect said brother.
Nick?
Cool. Hi, I'm Nick Binge, and I'm the author of Ascension, which is a sci-fi thriller that's coming out towards the end of April. So I've still got a little bit of time. It's about 6 weeks away. It's 25th of April in the US, and a couple of days later in the UK. And Ascension, I suppose, quick pitch for Ascension. It's the idea behind it is this enormous kind of snow-covered mountain, huge, bigger than Everest, just appears out of nowhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and nobody knows why it's there or where it's come from or has any real explanation for it at all. And we follow our kind of main character Harold and a team of scientists as they explore the mountain, trying to kind of work out what's going on. But as they start to climb it, things get weird. Kind of the less things make sense. Time starts to move differently. Minutes turn into hours, hours into days. And very dangerous things take place on the mountain. Let's say I don't want to give too many spoilers, but it's things don't go well for them in many ways. So yeah, that's out in a couple of months. A bit less actually, and yeah, excited to be here. Excited to chat about it and answer questions.
All right. I am Hadir Elspy. Hi, everyone. I am an Egyptian American fantasy author. My book is The Daughters of Izdihar, and it has actually come out already. So it came out in January of this year. And the sort of log line I've come up with for it is Sapphic suffragettes use elemental magic to fight the patriarchy in an Egyptian-inspired fantasy world. So it's a little long for a log line, but that's what I've got. And it's about two women who are very different in both means and personality, but they can both wield elemental magic, and they come together and join a women's rights group to try to win the vote for women. All the while, a neighboring country is not very happy about this sort of rise in elemental magic, and they are threatening attack. So they're sort of dealing with all of that while they are attempting to win the freedom to vote.
Yeah, I had 5 million questions when I was coming up with questions for this panel. Many that I had to strike because they are deal with redacted things that occur, towards the ending of everyone's books. But I think the first thing I want to start off with, because in any sci-fi fantasy in any sci-fi fantasy panel, I love to talk about world building because that's one of my favorite elements of the sci-fi fantasy genre. So I want to first ask, could you talk me through your research and world building process for your books? So Mia, do you want to start?
Sure. I didn't really have a research process initially because the idea for the world, which I comp to essentially, it's Men in Black, but with fairies. So there is a temp agency in which everybody, or the Fae are able to get a job with. And this came out of me asking my student when she had lost a tooth if the tooth fairy came, and the tooth fairy had not come. And I said, oh, she must have taken a sick day. And then I was like, oh, but do tooth fairies get sick days? Do they have like temps that will step in? Like what happens when Santa can't do the thing? And so that's the idea of the temp agency was born. And it just kind of expanded to world mythology. And then I had to do the research. So I relied very much on an old out of print encyclopedia called the Larousse Encyclopedia of World Mythology, which I don't know where I found it, but thanks to whoever had it when I bought it. Then I just kind of relied on my knowledge of mythologies from around the world and my own cultural mythology to build the world.
Yeah, I also didn't really have a process, so to speak. I think with sci-fi, particularly with kind of slightly more grounded sci-fi, which this is, sci-fi that's kind of ostensibly set in our real world, with things going weird. You need to kind of ground it in a sense of realism for the weird stuff to kind of be believable and to buy into it. So I actually did end up, as I was writing, having to do a lot of research around kind of all sorts of things, everything from kind of mountaineering through to kind of microbiology and quantum physics and time and all of that kind of stuff that's played with later in the book. And some of the stuff I already have as ideas because I read a lot of nonfiction as well as fiction, and I think that led into many of the ideas that I had from the book. I try and read as broadly as possible, but a lot of it was just kind of, as I was writing, trying to come up with something that worked for the plot and was cool and was thrilling and was exciting and all of these sorts of things, and then having to go, right, but how do I make this actually work? Like how would it really work in the real world? And having to do quite a lot of research there, kind of backwards afterwards. I'm fortunate to know a lot of very, very intelligent people who I could kind of go to and who could tell me that I was doing everything wrong, which happened a few times. I've got a good friend of mine who's a biologist who read the book and he was like, that none of that works the way you think it works. And I was like, okay, tell me how it works. I need to change this. So definitely relying on other people was a big part. But I think if nothing else, I learn a lot myself when writing books, just because I'm always interested to see how far I can push things and how far we can take things while still keeping them with it, having that sense of kind of grounded realism, that sense that, this could happen, maybe it might have happened. And so it's a fine line to tread, and it does involve doing quite a lot of reading. Definitely.
I had I think a lot more leeway because I'm doing secondary world fantasy, so I really could just like make things up. But I did want to very specifically like show a side of Egypt that isn't usually shown, that most people aren't familiar with. Like when you see Egyptian inspired stuff, it's usually all about ancient Egypt. So I did want to showcase like that, like more modern Egypt, so 19th century Egypt. So I ended up doing a lot of research into 19th century Egypt. So I read a lot of accounts of European travelers who went into the region and like wrote down their observations, which was really interesting. And you get a lot of like really, really specific details that way. And a lot of those details did make their way into the book. I also did a lot of research on the suffrage movement in Egypt, which happened in the 1950s. And it was something I had never really heard of or learned about, even though I spent a lot of time in Egypt, a lot of years there. It's not really something that was talked about. So I think my goal was really like not even to be super original with the world building, just to sort of like bring this side of Egypt to light and to just like have fun bringing all those historical details into the manuscript.
I feel like though with secondary world, you actually have to do a lot more research because everything has to be really consistent, and like some things can be inconsistent, but a lot of stuff does have to be consistent. So I don't know, Hadir. It feels like you did a lot. I had to research like my timeline because I have characters who have been alive for several hundred years. So I was in the Basran archives on France has like online archives of people who were born in their various regions. And so I was reading baptismal records in Latin of people born in Alsace in like 1785 to 1795. But like, that's about it. That was like an afternoon of research as opposed to the stuff I had to do for the next book, which is like reading a lot of nonfiction.
I'm totally on your page, Mia, with the timeline stuff. I think my copy editor almost killed me at one point because when she read the draft of the book, because just making sure that everything fits. I mean, as I spoke about in the kind of pitch, like in the book, time starts to kind of dilate in different ways, which in itself is complicated enough. But the book's also told through these letters is a kind of epistolary narrative from one of the climbers climbing up, and he's also kind of slowly going insane as he's climbing the mountain as well. So his own personal sense of time and what day it is also kind of going out of whack at the same time as time actually going out of whack. And so the dating on the letters gets all confused and stuff like that. And I was made to kind of like, when I was writing it, I was like free flow with it. I was like, a couple of days, I'm gonna put it down, and then afterwards, I was made to go down like, you need a strict timeline of exactly what's going on here. I was like,
as a copy editor, I feel you're a copy editor, because for the people who have never been copy edited and in fiction, oftentimes we are asked to keep a chapter by chapter summary or a timeline, or sometimes both, because I've done time travel books where I've had to do the timeline and also summarize everything. So yes, for those aspiring authors out there, please do keep a timeline. It's going to help you.
I should have done it from the start. Yeah.
One of the questions that I had kind of relates to a theme or like an element that I felt like all of your books kind of touch upon, which is this idea, or this how do I call it, like an intersection between choice and destiny. And so I would like to know, obviously I was trying to think of like non-spoilery ways to approach this question, but I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about what those two words kind of mean to your character at the beginning of the book, even though I know that things obviously evolve for them as they continue throughout the pages. Do you want to start, Mia?
Sure. I actually do have two main characters in my book, even though I didn't talk about the second guy. So Luke, I might as well start with him. He is somebody who is incredibly bound to his responsibility, because he feels as a person who came in on the ground level of this agency, this temp agency, that he has a responsibility to uphold the to do what he's been told to do, essentially. I'm trying not to spoil stuff that happens in the book, but he is best described as a company man. His work is his life. There is no work-life balance, because it's all work and no life. And he feels that if he doesn't really deserve a life because of the circumstances that brought him into the agency. As for my other character, she has sort of turned her back on her destiny. She is a direct descendant of the Chinese god of medicine, and she's supposed to be doing things like, helping people, healing people, protecting them. And she has turned her back on that because of the various circumstances that have brought her to her part of her life. And she really struggles with the things that she knows that she can do, but she also cannot do, because to kind of like release all the power, to come fully into her power, would reveal where she is. And that kind of clashes with her goal of protecting her brother. So she also feels sometimes that she doesn't have much of a choice, but she also did sort of make the choice to do what she did. So she's very trapped.
I think when I'm thinking about my book has one main kind of protagonist who's the narrator of the story and kind of telling it through these letters. And when I'm thinking about him at the beginning of the book, choice and kind of fate and destiny are very much tied up in his conception of faith, which is a big kind of theme in the book. And at the beginning of the book, he's lost all his faith because of, without kind of spoiling anything, something truly tragic happened kind of in his past, and where we meet him in the book, really he's kind of doing everything he can to escape that and to escape facing up to that. And I think that's all tied in with ideas of kind of destiny and choice, because on the one hand, he doesn't want to believe, as he once did, that there's a kind of bigger plan in place, that there's a kind of destiny, that there's a meaning, that we're all part of something grander, because if there is, he has to come to terms with the fact that what happened to him is part of that plan, and that's a kind of horrific thing to have to face up to. And there's this kind of idea that he almost doesn't want to believe in a god, because if he does, he'd almost kind of have to hate him a little bit for putting him through that. But at the same time, if there is no fate and it's all down to him and his choices, well, then he's on the line, right? He's responsible for some of the things that he's currently trying to run from. And so it's a big question that he deals with. And as he gets to the mountain, he's very palpably confronted with it, partly because there's a kind of sense that the team have almost been called there. There's questions around why they're there, and senses of kind of some kind of grander fate as well there, but also because of the time stuff causes him to kind of flash back and think about his past and have to confront things in his past. And I don't think it's really giving any spoilers, but certainly what I wanted to explore and what the character explores is coming to this conclusion that fate or destiny, whatever you want to call it, and free will and personal choice are not opposites, that they're actually far more intertwined than we sometimes like to think, and that actually they're two sides of the same coin. And that's something that I think he has to come to terms with as the book goes on.
I think for both of my main characters, I think they see destiny as a kind of prison almost. They see it as like expectations placed upon you by society that doesn't see you as a whole person. So my first main character, Nahel, is a very wealthy, privileged woman. But when we start out the book, she is arguing with her mother because she does not want to go through with the arranged marriage that has been set up for her. Even though, like, this is like, women in her world, they go through arranged marriages. Like, that's just the thing. Like, she's not really expected to do anything other than that, but she does, right? She's all about defying that destiny, that fate that the world has carved out for her. She wants her freedom of choice more than anything, and she'll do anything to get it. And then my other character, Georgina, she is sort of similarly bound by all of these expectations, but she has sort of less room to rebel against her destiny, because she's working class. She just doesn't have very many options and opportunities. So she is a little bit more reluctant to defy her fate. And sort of part of her arc is realizing that like it's okay to do that. Like, she can do that, and it's a risk, but that freedom of choice is very important.
I'm gonna segue or like transition a little bit into questions about the book specifically. Also, a reminder that if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I see already a few coming in, so please keep them rolling. I want to talk first. I want to start with bitter medicine, because I thought that responsibility and the way that Luke and Elle have like faced their responsibilities was a huge theme. Could you talk a little bit about the responsibilities that they face in the book? And also, did you have an easier time exploring this aspect in one of their perspectives or the other, right? Like, was it easier, basically? Who was easier to write?
I think culturally it was easier to write for Elle because, she faces a lot of family responsibility. She's a middle child, and middle children are often forgotten. And in her case, it was both a blessing and a curse, because she wanted to go and do something. She wanted to be an artist. Her family is not full of artists. Her family is full of healers, and she is expected to do that. But also, she can't run away from it, because something happened to her eldest brother, and now as the next in line, she has to be the person who steps up and protects him. With regards to how she faces her choices and her responsibilities, I feel like the characters in my book are very adult, in which, it's the feeling you get when you stare at a responsibility and you're like, I 200% do not want to do this, but I guess I'm gonna have to do it. And that is very much how both Luke and Elle approach their choices. Like they are on a collision course, and they just kind of have to be like, eyes open, here we go. There's no way out but through. And so they have to push through the consequences of their choices. Luke is much more resigned than Elle. He really thinks that he's got like nowhere to go in life until he meets her, and then he realizes that there are alternate paths to his life. And so he is also he is less of the eyes open driving forward, but more like, well, I'm going to end up there no matter what, so I guess I'm just going to lie down kind of person when it comes to responsibility. Unless it is about his little personal quest, which I think is a spoiler, so I shouldn't talk about that part.
Yeah, I think one of the things also, I don't know, I didn't put this in a question, but I did want to mention it. I think one of the themes also that bitter medicine talks a little bit about, we're specifically more in the latter half, so that's why I didn't want to make like a long question for it. But about like being seen for who you are versus what you can do. I think there's like one line that you're talking about in that book where that like comes up, and I just started crying when I read that one. I just felt like it was so succinctly put in a way that I think is like easy to say to people but hard to actualize, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are so many things about like when you meet a person, you often ask, what do you do? And like, who is this person? Oh, they are this vocation, this profession, this, this hobbyist, as opposed to, oh, this person's really funny. And I think they care very deeply about the world, and maybe they wear their heart on their sleeve a little too much. And that is kind of what bitter medicine is getting at. Like, who are you? And who do you want to be, and how do you want to be seen? And this is something that both these characters have to wrestle with. They know, in some cases, like in Luke's case, he knows exactly who he is, and he's really unapologetic about the things that he's done. He's like, yeah, I have regrets, and I'm not going to pretend that I can be redeemed for them. So like, I appreciate that in a character who's done bad and is like, yeah, I did that. But he is a person who is defined completely by his role and not by his personality, and he has a growth arc toward being defined by his personality.
Yeah, I think it's inspired me. Now you've inspired me. Whenever someone asks me what I do, I'm just gonna be like, I start hobbies and I never finish them.
That's so relatable, though.
Yeah,
Like,
it's never anymore.
About then, like, oh, the weather, like it's so hot today or something.
Mm-hmm. That'll be my new defining characteristic. I want to also talk in Ascension. I was rereading this question a couple of times before this panel, and I was like, I don't know if I made a typo for fate or faith. I feel like in my mind I wanted to say faith, but I think I actually typed fate. But anyway, for the question for Ascension, as you mentioned a little bit before, a large chunk of your book tackles this idea of fate/faith and science. And I wanted to know if you could describe the inspiration you had for these conversations in the book. And also, as like a side fun question that I had about Ascension, if you had a favorite character who makes the trek up the mountain, because you put your characters through a lot to get them where they are and like to get them hiking. As someone who would not hike up a mountain ever, I felt for them.
I felt for them too, because I'm not like, I look at people who climb Everest, and I'm like, you're insane. I don't know what you're doing with your life. But that kind of fascinates me, and that's maybe why I was writing about it. But it wouldn't be me. But yeah, I think if you're talking about some of the things that inspired me, the book, when I started writing the book, it was totally envisioned in my head as a kind of love letter to Gothic fiction, but to also like some of the really early science fiction. And so you can see that in kind of the way that there's an epistolary narrative, right? It's told through letters in that kind of Frankenstein Dracula-esque way. It's got a kind of framing narrative at the beginning, so that the opening forward, as it were, is the brother of the main protagonist, who kind of like finds him in a mental health facility after he's been missing for 30 years, and he's gone crazy, and he's got this like briefcase full of letters, and like and then he ends up like setting himself on fire. It's not a spoiler; it's in the first chapter. It's fine. And so there's kind of that kind of madness, like Edgar Allan Poe-esque kind of madness going on as well. But also very much the kind of the early sci-fi, the stuff like Frankenstein and things like that were really like pushing the boundaries of the fringes of science. Like where does our scientific understanding of the world end? Where can it end? And that kind of stuff fascinates me. I love that kind of fringe exploratory stuff that looks at not just kind of what we don't know, but even what we can't know. Is there a point of where we have to be like, okay, this is literally inconceivable to the human mind because of whatever it might be. And that fascinates me, and exploring. And for me, that's kind of where the boundary of faith and science start to kind of intertwine, right? That's people look for faith in the areas where scientific explanation doesn't cut the mustard. It doesn't work. It's not enough. And I think the mixture between those two is fascinating. And for me, it was very much a callback to the kind of the very early beginnings of science fiction. And so, yeah, I was fascinated by that. In terms of a favorite character, I have a favorite character, and I don't know if it will surprise you or not. My favorite character, because he was so much fun to write, even though he's a terrible human being, is Betton, the Roger Betton, the mountaineer character. So for context, he's a few different people are brought to some are kind of military, some are scientists, and they're being led by this world-class mountaineer, right? Who's like climbed loads of peaks and stuff like that. And he is the most arrogant, egotistical, like asshole you will ever meet in your entire life. And I never intended to write him like that. Like when I first imagined writing him as a character in my head, and like some stuff I had planned out in the book, he was actually in my head kind of like almost quite heroic, like quite stoic, quite like, and I started writing him, and I'm quite a discovery writer. I tend not to know where my characters or my scenes are going until I'm actually writing them. And I started writing him, and just, I don't know, as I was writing, I was like, wow, okay, no, you're an asshole. That's fine. Okay, we'll run with that. Like that's how you are. But I had a lot of fun writing him. I think because he does have complexity, and he does have layers which come out later on in the book. But there's something about the goal was to write a character who was so obviously a terrible person and begrudgingly make the reader respect him as the book goes on. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make both from my narrator's perspective and from the reader, to kind of, by the end of the book, you kind of begrudgingly go, okay, actually I can see where you're coming from, or like have some kind of begrudging respect, even though he's terrible. And that was a challenge and also fun to write. And so he ended up being my favorite character.
I'm going to jump in real fast and say I also have a jerk of a secondary character who is my favorite, who is the like antithesis of the main character. If Ella is extremely bound by her duty and her responsibility, her elder brother Tony doesn't give a crap about it, and he has. Are we allowed to cuss on this? Okay, he has.
I kind of just jumped right in now.
Yeah, like he has fucked off into the land of no responsibility and is a terrible older brother. So yeah, she kind of takes on both his responsibility and hers. All right, I'm going to let Hadir talk.
I really love that you mentioned the Gothic, like the homage basically to the Gothic, because that's totally the vibe. When I first found the frame narrative and the letters, Frankenstein is immediately what I thought of. I immediately was like, in my notes, I think you can see like frame narrative, letters. It just like immediately jumps out to you as being something that feels very, I don't know, it's like very unique, but also very like it evokes things very instantaneously, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you said that, because that's totally what I was going for. Like that's exactly that kind of homage, and that kind of making you kind of think back to those texts and kind of and bring those vibes, of which there are so many vibes of all the like old classic Gothic books, just kind of bring them with you into the text as you're going up. Was totally the point. Yeah, so I'm really glad that came through.
And so for the Daughters of Izdahar, you already talked a little bit about your two main characters, but I wanted you to delve a little bit more into depth, because I think that when you read the synopsis, or when I read the synopsis, I kind of just assumed based on like how it was laid out, you know, like first one and then the other, that it would be that they kind of exist sort of as like opposition characters, almost like foils. But then as I was reading the book, I realized that there are actually so many similarities and so many things that they're like struggling with in different ways, but are complicated by like, you know, society. So I wanted to know if you could talk about how it was to write these two characters specifically, and also like their character evolution, as you either where you as you're drafting, but like also in the book.
Yes. I think I really enjoy writing multi POV in general, and I find that easier a lot of the time. And I think it was really helpful when doing that to have these two characters who are very different, right? So like different in means, different, completely different in personality. It was great to have them like kind of bounce off each other so naturally. And like despite all their differences, like you said, like they do have arcs that dovetail, right? They are struggling against the same thing, right? They're struggling against their patriarchal society, so they are dealing with very similar issues, even though they're sort of going at it in like completely different ways. Um, I really wanted to explore like the different layers of privilege and oppression, right? So like they both experience sexism as women, but like Nahel as a very wealthy, privileged woman experiences it in a very different way than Georgina, who just doesn't have as many resources for to like deal with all of this stuff. And their development kind of like goes in like opposite directions almost. So Georgina is learning to be a lot more assertive, to open up a little bit more, to sort of fight for herself a little bit more, whereas Nahel is almost kind of like trying to learn to tamp down her baser instincts, I guess. um so like she was I would say like the more fun character to write, just going back on what you guys were saying about how like it can be like the annoying characters that are a little bit more fun to write. Like I think I get a lot of feedback that Nahel is kind of annoying, and yeah, she can be, she's kind of written that way. She's just very like headstrong and heedless of everything that surrounds her, and I think that is because she grew up so privileged, right? She grew up used to getting what she wanted. um and now she's sort of chafing against these restrictions and expectations that society's placed on her. um and yeah, it's really fun writing Nahel and Georgina interacting because they're so different. I think they bounce off of each other really well. And yet they like, even though they get frustrated with each other because of these differences, I think they also both really admire certain aspects of the other one, because they sort of like they know that like whatever they need to improve on in themselves, they could see that in the other person. So I think they sort of find like this natural chemistry.
Yeah, and even going from like the very first meeting, because it's
Yeah.
I don't know if, and you know, if people haven't read the synopsis, it's not they're not like they weren't friends forever. Do you know what I mean? Like they meet in the book very much, but even the relationship or the way that that relationship evolves and like pushes and pulls between what you were saying, right? Like times where they understand each other more, but then times where it's like, no, you don't understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah, yeah. And I wanted to like it was a fine line to walk, because like so the man that Nahel is arranged to marry is actually Georgina's lover. So that is sort of how they are drawn together. And I really wanted to avoid that like stereotypical like, jealousy, romantic rivalry situation, but I also didn't want to veer off into the other side and just make them like best friends forever all of a sudden, because they are different, and like they wouldn't normally, be friends if they had met under any other circumstances. They wouldn't normally be drawn to each other. So it was all about like balancing that relationship and making sure it didn't veer into stereotypes, but also wasn't just like all sunshine and rainbows all of a sudden.
Yeah, I definitely appreciated that because I think when I first found that out, I was like, oh, is this going to be like a love triangle kind of situation? But their dynamic is so much more like realistically complicated than that. I feel like there's just so many they're so grounded in their backgrounds and their families that like tie them to who they are as people. Oh wait, sorry. We got an audience question, so I think I'll pop over to that, and then also if anyone else has questions, put them in the chat. So the question that we got was, fast forward to promoting your books after pub. So the Daughters of Ishtar is after pub, but if you were at a conference/festival and could be in a conversation with any other author besides each other, obviously, who would be a good/fun fit? I don't know who wants to start.
Well, I'll say that I kind of already had like, you know, that dream experience in my launch event. So I got to launch with one of my favorite authors, Shannon Chakraborty, whose Devabot series was inspired by a lot of like part of it is like Egyptian history and culture and sort of like you know, Muslim folklore and all of that. So I think she was like a natural person for me to launch with, and it helps that I like absolutely love her books and her writing. So that was great. Yeah, so she'd be my choice again.
There's so many authors that I like, love and respect and would love to be in conversation with. I mean, people that immediately come to mind that I just want to talk to about their books is Blake Crouch, who kind of, I suppose, writes in a similar space to me, of that kind of sci-fi thriller type thing. But one thing I've always respected so much about his work, and I think about when I write my own books, is he has this way of like, he has this way of writing thrillers that kind of the escalates the tension, amps up the conflict to the point where you're just like, by about 2/3 of the way through the book, you're like, this literally could not escalate any further. This is the most intense it can possibly be. And then he has this moment about 2/3 of the way into his books where he's like, hold my beer, I'm going in. Like, and it just goes completely mental. And there's a kind of there's just this boldness to his writing. There's this sense that kind of he's not restricted by I don't know what it is, inhibitions in the same kind of way that I really respect, particularly kind of in his climaxes and towards the end of his books. And I'd love to talk to him about that, because it's something that I've taken inspiration of. But also the dream thing, another person that I think is an amazing writer is Christopher Priest, who wrote famously The Prestige, that got made into the Christopher Nolan film and things like that, and that kind of like weird, again, kind of sci-fi space. But I am actually on a panel with him in June, which is amazing, at Chimera Festival, which is the festival here in Edinburgh. So that was exciting when I found that out. I was like, oh my god, I'm gonna have to like hold in my gushing while I'm sitting next to him on a panel.
This is a hard one for me because there's so many, like Nick said, there's so many authors. And then of course, as soon as you ask me, every single name flies out of my brain. So a toughie. I'm going to veer to the other genre that my book is in, because we are definitely fantasy, but it's also like, it's got half its body in romance. So I probably would love to chat with Alyssa Cole or Courtney Milan, because I love both of them, first of all. Alyssa is actually one of the biggest reasons why I ended up writing this book. So it would be really great to sit and talk with her from like the very beginning, when I was like starting to revise, all the way to like, look what I got. Like I made a thing. And Courtney, who I have like the most respect for, like just incredibly deep respect for. As for the sci-fi fantasy side, you're gonna have to come back to me on that one, because there's so many authors. And I think the tough part for me is that Bitter Medicine didn't really have comps, so it's not quite in conversation with anything yet. It's in conversation with other types of media, and it's in conversation with multiple genres, but there's nothing quite like it, I think. Maybe the closest would be like the more Asian-inspired urban fantasies by like Marjorie Liu, which was something I did comp when I was querying this.
I want to go to, I have a few questions that kind of pair books together, and I want to I want to pop back to those while I wait to see if anyone else has any audience questions. So I love that The Daughters of Izdahar and Bitter Medicine feature queer characters, and I love queer fantasy books. Could both of you talk about some of your other queer fantasy books that you love, or some that you were inspired by? It doesn't have to be for like your specific books, but just inspired in general. Hadir, do you want to start? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
There we go. Sorry. I think the first like sapphic fantasy book that I ever read, I was really young. I was like 12, and it was by Amelia Edwater Rhodes. And it was like the third book in this like 6 or 7 book fantasy trilogy. The book was called Wolf Song. And I think that like sort of paved the path, like set the foundation, because I think it was the first time I'd ever read something like that in fantasy. And so it sort of like, was an awakening in a way. So that was really great. And then when I was a little older, I think like high school, college, early college, I read Melinda Lowe's books, Ash and Huntress. And to this day, I think like there's just something about those books that were just so foundational, and they really have just stuck with me to this day.
I feel very fortunate having grown up reading fantasy where queerness was very normalized. So we had stuff like the Heralds of Valdemar, where there are a lot of queer people in the Valdemar series, and in Melanie Ron's Ambre series, where people are just like there are same-sex relationships. And I'm also a musician, so this is sort of like my life, and these are the people I'm surrounded by. So of course they make their way into my fiction. For more recent stuff, I've really enjoyed Iona Dat. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. Iona Dat Sharma's novella called Penhallow Amid Passing Things. It's really, really atmospheric, and I appreciate something that's super atmospheric, like like a Kazuo Ishiguro, who is so good at just like creating this like tense, misty, extremely British atmosphere in his books.
And then to pair both Ascension and Bitter Medicine, so both of your books are standalone books. Could you talk about the drafting process? Did you ever feel like you were going, on a different path and you needed to like, prune it back or go back to like the main storyline? And then my second part of the question is, would you ever want to return to the world or any of the characters, like side characters, basically? Do you want to start, Nick?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Ascension kind of has to be a standalone for various reasons. I'm not sure the extent to which I want to spoil. I'm not sure. It's kind of spoiled at the beginning of the book anyway. Like it's kind of you kind of know, but everyone dies. Everyone. No character makes that out of the book alive, so I can't really write about anyone else. So yeah, it kind of has to be a standalone in that way. But definitely, I always envisaged it as a standalone, and I kind of, when I had the end in mind, I knew where I was going to, and I knew how that end would be, and that I couldn't kind of see that going in any direction. How I got from the beginning of the book to the end, I often had no idea until I was actually writing it. So there were definitely stuff that I had to kind of prune back and directions that I went in that I had to cut off. I had about 4 or 5 extra characters that were also like on the expedition in the very, very first stages. And then as I was writing it, I was like, this is just too many characters. So I just had to start cutting them out because I knew the book would sprawl and there wasn't space for them. So there was a little bit of that. But yeah, I've never envisaged it as anything more than that. I kind of, standalones make more sense to me personally, though I love reading sequels and trilogies, particularly in the SFF space. I mean, fantasy and sci-fi traditionally lend themselves to the kind of the sprawling trilogies and quadrilogies and more than that. But I don't know. I think when I get to the end of a book, well, usually about halfway through the book that I'm writing, I get the idea for the next book and I get really excited about it. And I have to kind of like be like, oh, I have to finish this one. But it's usually, which is why I don't think I could maintain the focus in the same world and the same characters for 3 books, because I'm just like, I want to write about a new idea, a new place, new characters, new people, and things like that. So that was never really an option for me. But yeah, always stand alone in my head.
Technically, Bitter Medicine is a standalone, and it's a standalone because of my contract. My publisher does standalones only. That doesn't preclude linked books in a series, like a loose series. So perhaps the larger story of the larger Roland and Riddle world is greater than one book. And depending on how the sales go, everybody please pre-order my book so I can write a second one. I would love to write the next one, which does feature Tony, and I like dropped the title in the book itself already. So yeah, I'm gonna cross my fingers. The initial very grand, extremely overambitious, why did I even think of this idea, was to have 5 in a series, very much like urban fantasy, because I modeled this off urban fantasy and romance, which, like 17 books later, I would not write a 17-book series. My brain is only so large. But, there was originally supposed to be 5, and then I pared it back to 3, and I think 3 is still manageable. So I have gotten some comments about a storyline or a plot line that was dropped partway through Bitter Medicine. And one character tells the other, hey, this is now my problem. I'm taking it off your shoulders. This is not my problem. And he really does make it his problem. And that's why the storyline totally disappears, because he actually did what he said he was going to do. Shockingly.
Yeah, I would love ones in that like world. I felt like that is such a ripe world for like, even I would just read like just bureaucratic day-to-day stuff from the world, like the portal people, right? The people who are just like letting people through portals. I'd read that. Like I thought it was a really cool, the little spritzes of like urban fantasy world buildings you have, I think lend themselves really well to yeah, like Stan, like Companion, is that like the title, like the official name for it, where it's like kind of like a sequel, but it's not really a sequel. It's like a cousin, basically. Another question I had, which links Ascension and the Daughters of Izdahar, I thought that it was a really fantastic the way you're both able to balance personal stakes versus like big stakes. So large world stakes, community stakes, stakes that are not just about the personal. And I wondered if you both could talk about how you created your main characters and their relationships / backstories in relation to this idea of like balancing stakes. I don't know. I was reading this question. I was like, it makes a lot of sense in my head. But now that I'm trying to explain it in like real life, I realize it doesn't make as much sense. But how do you create a character which is able to balance those things in a realistic way, I guess? Hadir, do you want to start?
Yeah. I think it was something that I actually kind of struggled with a little bit. Like, I think in my first draft, I was kind of having a hard time, like, tying it all in together, making sure that the personal stakes and the world stakes were not as divorced, I guess, from each other. Which I mean, you would think it would be simple considering, like it's all about like, women's rights, and my characters are women and they're fighting for these rights. But I think I just needed to sort of make certain things dovetail a little bit more. So like, for example, there is a magic school storyline in the book. So Nahel really wants to attend this academy to learn to use her magic. And I had to sort of figure out a way to tie that larger conflict of the Daughters of Izdahar, like their fight for the vote. I had to figure out a way to sort of tie that in with Nahel and her desire to go to the school, right? So that it didn't seem like she was just sort of like, vibing and just, joining this this women's rights group just because, so that it wasn't like as abstract. So it just required a little like finagling, I think. Yeah, so like even like the characters' identities and social roles are very tied up in their personal stakes. I think it was just a matter of just trying to externalize that more clearly, if that makes sense.
I think in Ascension, the personal stakes were always the heart of the story for me. The story is, yeah, there's like thriller stuff going on, and like, you know, people are like stabbing each other in the back, literally, and like, you know, running away from monsters and all of that kind of stuff. But the emotional journey and the emotional kind of arc of Harold, the protagonist, which in some ways is easier to explore in a kind of first person kind of epistolary narrative point of view. We can really get into his head. For me, that was always the heart of the book and the heart of the story I wanted to tell. And like there are ways in which they reflect one another. I mean, philosophically, the kind of the climbing of the mountain is the emotional journey and all of that kind of stuff, you know. And on a kind of, that sounds very kind of cliche when I'm saying it, but it's deeper than that, I promise. But yeah, no, the story I always wanted to tell it was a very personal one and a very emotional one. I think when I think about, because like I said, it's an homage to kind of gothic horror, and there's a lot of kind of horror in it. And when I think about horror, what was important to me was to explore the stuff that really scares us in real life. And for me, the stuff that really scares us is not like, you know, it's not the childhood fears. It's not the monsters under the bed or the dark, or like, you know, people sneaking up on you and trying to stab you and stuff like that in day-to-day life, right? For most people, hopefully. But it's the deeper and more emotional pain. I mean, I wrote the book after becoming a dad myself, after my son was born, and a lot of the emotional journey is about fatherhood in the book. And when I think about horror, and when I think about the scariest, you know, things in the world to a parent, like that's the most kind of obvious place to go. That's real horror for me. And like so maybe it was just cathartic in a sense, but I felt like the personal stakes, even though you've got this like huge world changing scientific concept that like literally forces, by the end of the book, the characters to completely question their understanding of what it means to be human, right? Even though you've got that, for me, that actually feels in the book, or it did when I was writing it, smaller than the emotional stakes of the main character. Like that felt bigger, even though it was very individual and very personal. And yeah, I always had that in the forefront of my mind. I never wanted that to kind of get lost in all the big stuff that was happening.
Okay. I think we have time for one or two smaller questions. So I'm going to ask a few smaller questions. The first was, if you had, I'm very bad at titles for anything. If you can see the titles that I've named all these panels for these, they're the most boring titles. Even in my email, it's like adult sci-fi fantasy debut panel 2, 3. Like that's the extent of my skills. So I wanted to know, if you had to give your book another title, what would it be? Mia, do you want to start?
I am also similarly bad at titles. The working project name for this was The Temp Agency for like literally 5 years. So please don't ask me. As a classical musician, we also don't name things. So it is like, you know, Nocturne number 7, Opus 32, number 3. Like, yeah. Sorry.
My book also had a different title when I queried it, because I'm also terrible at titles. That there's this running quote from the book that's returned to and kind of dealt with in various different lights from The Tempest. It's a Shakespeare quote, because I'm pretentious. It's and part of that quote is has "Thou shalt be free as mountain winds, but then do all points of my command." It's a quote Prospero says in The Tempest. And when I queried the book, the title was "Free as Mountain Winds." That was the name of the book. And after I signed with my agent, he was like, "Yeah, we're changing that. That's a terrible title." It's like, okay, fair. It is. I couldn't think of anything else. So yeah, it did have an alternate title, but Ascension is a much better title.
Yeah, I also had a very similar experience. So I queried it with a different title. It was called City of Sand and Strife, which like is just very generic. Yeah, my agent also, looked at it and was like, "Yeah, we should probably change that." And they were actually the ones who came up with the Daughters of Istahar.
This is all like jogging free, the things that I've buried like beneath many layers of silt in my memory. So like I said, bad at titles, and I had originally titled before the rewrite that pushed it more toward fantasy. This is more romance, and I called it A Brush with Love because of all the painting. And my husband was like, "So is she like a dentist?" And I was like, "Oh." So we had to rename it. And as it turns out, Maisie Eddings has a romance book out called A Brush with Love, and it's about a dentist. So good thing I didn't go with that title.
Nick and Mia, you had a different title at the beginning. Who made your title? Like, who came up with it? Oh, so you just went back to the drawing board and you were like, "Oh, bitter medicine."
I came up with the new title too, eventually,
Oh, okay.
after a lot of thinking about it and being told that my other titles were terrible.
Okay.
Yeah, the only strategy I have for title making is to like do a word cloud of themes and things in my book, and I literally just get a blank piece of paper and start writing like words and phrases down, and then I'm like, okay, we're gonna play some Mad Libs here, and eventually, yeah, we got that.
I did have a moment when I realized that there was a word. So Ascension obviously literally describes an ascent up a mountain. That makes sense, right? But I'm not going to give any spoilers, but when you get to the book, you'll realize that the word has multiple meanings. It has like a double meaning in the kind of the background of the book. And when I realized that, I was like, "Oh my God, that's amazing." I got so excited about it. I was like, I really hope people like this. Just so excited that there's like a word with two meanings that worked for like both aspects of the book.
Another question I had was, what are some other 2023 debuts you're looking forward to this year? It doesn't have to be adult sci-fi fantasy. It can be if you want to. It doesn't have to be. Hadir, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. One that I'm looking forward to that hasn't come out yet is called The Jasad Heir by Sarah Hashem. It's another Egyptian-inspired fantasy, so looking forward to that. And then two others that have both came out in January, actually, same month as me. But that I haven't gotten around to reading yet. Maya Ibrahim's Spice Road, another like Arab-inspired fantasy, and then Hannah Kaner's God Killer, which I've heard really, really great things about.
God Killer was great.
Oh, nice.
I read it. I got an arc of it because we're both published with Harper Voyager. So like basically I saw the cover, which is gorgeous.
Yeah.
And I immediately emailed my editor and I was like, "Can I have an arc, please?" And they sent me one. And it's great.
Yeah, I have I very like fancy the Illumicrate edition because it was in the Illumicrate January box. But yeah, it's sitting on my shelf. I'm gonna read it soon.
I have been so bad at memorizing all the titles that I want to read. It's just like this one with this cover, but Yume Kitase's The Deep Sky is a sci-fi thriller.
I was going to say that.
Yes, The Deep Sky. It sounds really good. There is I'm flogging Milkweed editions all the time because I love everything that they do, but it's just an incredible slate of books coming up from Milkweed Editions. If you like nonfiction, that is like the prose in the writing is just absolutely incredible. Like I read Elizabeth Rush's Rising, and it's a book about the changing coastline in the U.S. and how the marshlands have been either developed out or eroded, and how the changing climate is affecting all the people who are on the coasts. She was like a Pulitzer Prize nominee, so like it's incredible. This is not a 2023 book, so I guess I can't talk about it. But there are so many books that I was just saying to Lindley before we got on here. I just picked up Annalee Newitz's The Terraformers, and I picked up Simon Jimenez's The Spear Cuts Through Water. Looking very much forward to reading both of those whenever I can.
Yeah, I was gonna say The Deep Sky as well, which looks great. It looks like it's like a thriller, like a locked room thriller set on a spaceship where like nobody can get off, but somebody's blowing stuff up and nobody knows who, and just like inject that directly into my veins. That sounds amazing. And the other one that I am also really looking forward to is Camp Zero by Michelle Min-Sterling. Looks really interesting. It's kind of near future dystopian type vibe in like post climate crisis America, but it looks like this really interesting like take on particularly climate displaced people and what happens when inevitably people are going to get displaced by climate change and have to go to various camps and stuff like that, and where they go and what they leave behind and all of these sorts of things. I've heard really good things about it already. I'm pretty sure it's not out yet. I think it comes out later this year.
I have to jump in. Sorry, I know like we're at an hour, but there is a book called That Self-Same Metal by Brittany Williams that's coming out. It's a historical fantasy with like metallurgy, and it's like, you know, she's like a metal bender, which sounds so cool. I have an arc of it. I would love to have time to read it. Same with S.L. Huang's The Water Outlaws. Because, you know, I'm a wuxia and xianxia fan, and that is a retelling of one of the 4 like classic Chinese epics that we've got. So yeah, I have so much to read and not enough time to do it in.
I love all the book titles. I'm also just like jotting them down as well. Before we wrap up or before we say goodbye, I do want to mention that we did chat in the YA Sci-Fi Fantasy debut panel with Spice Road, so that was fantastic. And we will also be chatting with Godkiller and the Same Self Metal. But that was right, the Self-Same Metal.
I believe it's a Shakespeare reference.
Yeah, so I'm so excited for those ones to come out later in the live series for the debut panels. Thank you all so much for chatting. Thank you to the question from the chat. I wish that we could have like a spoiler chat where we could just talk about like the last 30% of everyone's books, because there are a lot of questions that I had about them. I have things I'd like to know about it. So maybe I'll just like write them down and then I'll email them later. But like I have things I'd like to know. But anyway, thank you so much for chatting. Everyone's links to all the books are below in the description box. So definitely pick them up and also pre-order them so we can get more Bitter Medicine Part 2s for us all. And yeah, I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day, and we'll see you in the next part of this adult sci-fi fantasy debut panel, Part 2.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.